what was one of the biggest surprises where you had thought in your head how deer used that farm versus how
Mhm.
they actually used it with the drone? Was there a lot of surprises where you're like, "Whoa."
Yeah. There were quite a few, like, in the early season, I noticed, there's some fields around the property because the property, it's almost 1,000 acres of continuous big timber and kind
Mhm.
of hill country, and there's some kind of just CRP and mixed whatever native fields on the north side, and I think they run cattle in them every once in a while, but, whenever I'm flying over my property, I can just spin the drone in that direction, and I can still see over their property. I don't have to fly over them.
Mhm.
And in the early season specifically, I'm finding like 15, 25 deer just standing out in these fields and bedding in these fields all the time. And my brain's like, well, why are you guys doing that type situation? So then I started kind of driving the dirt roads and analyzing these fields a little bit deeper. And I started figuring out kind of why, and it was because you couldn't see the fields from the dirt road, and obviously those fields were retaining a lot of native browse. They had water. They had probably the most mature acorn trees that were receiving the most sunlight and the most runoff from water.
On
So
the
they
edges
were,
of the field.
yeah, kind of on the edges of the field. So those ones were going to be producing the largest acorn production, and then they were also probably dropping them the soonest, and, so I started kinda, like, piecing those things together, and it was like, starts making a lot of sense why these deer were hanging out there, but we never realized they did. And then another one, the property has a creek that runs through it. I guess technically it's called a river. It's borderline a creek, um, but it's dry most of the season, and whenever it rains and floods and whatnot, then it can get way above your head type thing.
Mhm.
And I'd always wondered how deer traveled across that extremely steep type of section where there's cliffs and bluffs and all sorts of nasty terrain in that area. And I'd really always wondered which travel route they always took to connect kind of the north section of the property to the south section of the property. And that's whenever I realized how effective utilizing that terrain X was. And I'd already known where a lot of the bluffs were and all the cliffs were and whatnot, but I never really pieced it together on a map
Mhm.
to break down where all these funnels really were on a hill country property. And after I did it with this one, and well, at first I saw where a mature buck had walked, and I was like, well, that makes complete sense. And then I figured out the terrain X thing, and I started marking off all of these areas where deer literally cannot travel. And then I went in field, and then I kind of re-verified it again, where like there's cliffs and there's bluffs and there's all these things in these areas, so there's no way they can travel through it. And then I mimicked it on other people's properties, and then I started seeing like, oh crap, this is a pretty effective way to like quickly narrow down where deer have to travel on a property, especially in hill country. Now, obviously, it's not the same for like agriculture property, but in the end, like you can really go into like a piece of public if it's hill country and preemptively map out on a software where all of these potential funnels are using that kind of lidar technology, and
Mhm.
then go in field and kind of quickly verify it whenever you're doing your first day scout. And I mean, it'll put you in a dramatic leg up right out front. So
Yeah, and Terrain X, just for everyone that isn't familiar, explain that really briefly. I watched that video, and it was really really cool to see that process. Taking
yeah.
the Terrain X mapping and then tracing it out on Onyx, and then going out and verifying with the field. So real
Yeah.
quickly, what is that for people who don't know?
Yeah, TrainX, it's just Onyx owns it, and it's kind of in beta format right now. And there's a particular portion in it where you can drag slope angle, and you can start to adjust the terrain, and it'll shade the terrain dependent upon slope angle. And I'd found, like I'd said, I already knew where a lot of the bluffs and everything were on the property and the cliffs. So and there's a lot of like 5 to 8 foot ones that run inside of these ridge systems for whatever reason. And I was noticing whenever you drag that slope angle down to 37 degrees, then it starts shading every single one of those cliffs on the inside of those ridges. And it was like, it's pretty fascinating. So that's kind of like where I said I went and then I duplicated it on multiple properties to see like, is this just an anomaly for mine where it only picks them up at 37 degrees, or is this everybody's? And I started noticing that it's kind of everybody's. It was really really effective. And then for the next portion, I drag it back to I believe 25 degrees, and then I just kind of block off that whole section that gets shaded from 25 degrees, and then go in field and I analyze it. And really, what I'm looking for at 25 degrees is a type of terrain feature that if you were to climb it as a human, you would every once in a while have to go to all fours or like reach for tree limbs and these types of things. Like it's just an uncomfortable climb for most people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, That's what I'm looking for. Anything less than that, then I don't really put much stock into it. But if it's truly difficult to traverse up and down, and you're having to go to all fours, then what I've seen with drone is that a lot of times deer aren't traveling up, up and down those areas. And the only time that I've seen them travel in these types of 25-degree slope areas is whenever there's kind of a bench, like a 1 foot to a 2 foot bench carved into the landscape, into the side of that kind of terrain feature. And it's just an area where does and bucks kind of travel along inside of it. And it's a really, really tight funnel. I'm not sure. I haven't seen many mature bucks utilize those. I know that they do. I mean, there's no way that they don't walk on those every once in a while. But in the end, with the 25-degree terrain feature, I'm really looking for something, like I said, you have to go on all fours for. And the thinking is that if a mature buck had to bust away from something, like he picked up your scent or whatnot, he can run up and down that thing like nobody's business. But oftentimes he's not going to. So
Mhm.
you're just trying to eliminate that as an idea that he's going to use as an everyday travel route, and it's more of kind of an emergency situation. If he had to, he'll use it. So
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think
and
that
one more thing on that as well. I didn't mention. I like to mention, if all you have as your terrain features are 25-degree terrain slopes, and that's everywhere, and then obviously the deer are going to be utilizing that because they kind of have to. But
Mhm.
anyways, that's all. So
Yeah. So, and then, yeah, I think that's really interesting. That video, I encourage everyone to go watch because you did a really good job of you do a really good job explaining a lot of the stuff on your channels, where you do a really good job of breaking down the information and making it make sense for people who are maybe newer, or even people that are looking at more aggressive terrain than maybe what they're used to. And so I think that was a really interesting video. Speaking of terrain features and also areas where you didn't necessarily see a lot of deer travel through. There was, I think it was one of your more recent videos where it was like a giant kind of a spine where it was, and I don't know if
yeah,
you know where I'm talking about, but basically,
yeah,
and we
oh
can
yeah,
put a B-roll clip in here, but basically, I don't know if it in the screenshot if it was north southwest orientation, but there was like a giant
hmm
cliff, then a less subtle but still bluffy on the other side where you would think bucks would just run up and down that thing.
yeah,
And what was your findings on that?
yeah,
Because I
yeah.
know
No,
everyone has found something like this. Like, oh man, I'm gonna get on here and my scent's gonna blow off the
mhm,
cliff, and they're just gonna walk right down this 2 lane highway, and I'm gonna
yeah.
get an awesome shot.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was an insane terrain feature in terms of, if you're just viewing it from a topographical perspective, you'll immediately think like tightest funnel on the property right there. That's a great spot. And then you're also undetected because, like you said, you have a bluff or maybe potential cliffs off to the, I think it was to the southwest, because I think that spine, what you'd call it, was oriented from the northwest, aiming down towards the southeast.
Mhm.
But that didn't really matter. Anyways, yeah, what I was finding was deer just weren't traveling across that thing that often, and I'd flown in that area quite a bit, and they almost always just walked around it. If they wanted to get from, and there was a lot of other terrain features that kind of forced them to stay within this area. If
Mhm.
if they wanted to leave this area, they would have had to walk a long trek around. So basically, any of the deer that were wanting to take this little spine that you're talking about, they were trying to get to this peninsula to the south, where a guy had a food plot, and then there was a pond or two kind of on it. And then there were also, it kind of turned into a little bit of an acorn flat as well. So there were a lot of acorns in that area. And what I was noticing is deer were kind of traveling. There was a clear cut to the north of it, and they were just traveling around it and then down a drainage and then back up the drainage on the other side, taking it was at least 2 times the distance to make that trek, all the way around this spine. And instead of hitting across the spine, I started thinking about it even more as to why are deer doing that, and why are they not utilizing this quick little highway that would just be perfect? And I think it's from the perspective that, if you make it onto the quick little highway of the bridge itself that's kind of connecting these two pieces of land, then you have a predator magically appear on both sides of you, then you're screwed. Like, you're going to have to either jump off the cliff to the southwest, or you're going to have to try to navigate the nasty terrain that was in the other direction, or you can try to run through your predators on either side of you. And I think that a lot of deer weren't willing to take that risk. The only time that I'd seen them take the risk was, one of them did it. It was the 6x5 that I'd done research on. He did it in really, it was pretty inclement weather on that day. And maybe he was just trying to avoid taking extra steps. And then I'd seen it happen a couple times during the rut with other bucks. And oftentimes they weren't mature bucks. They were just they were a little bit younger bucks, 2 to 3,
Mhm.
maybe a 4-year-old in there every once in a while. I don't have the exact ages on all the deer that on the property. I have some, but especially the mature ones, I'm pretty close. But yeah, the 2 to 3 year olds and 4 year olds are pretty hard to ID. But I know for a fact that the deer that we're using it, oftentimes they weren't mature. So
Hmm.